Jesus became aware of this, he departed. Many crowds followed him, and he cured all of them. And he ordered them not to make him known. He was to fulfill what he had spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick, until he brings justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope.
I'd like to start by praying, God, thanks. Thanks for Jesus. Thanks for who he was and what he's about. Thanks for this story that you tell about this alternative way to be human. And thanks for this cultural moment where we're in, where just drifting doesn't seem to be a luxury we have, but really digging in and being intentional in our connection with you seems to really be the opportunity. So pray for people and their family and their professions. Think especially of our police officers and our medical people and our teachers and our small business owners, but really everyone, Lord, our kids. Would you help us seize the opportunities you're giving us in this season? Amen. So if I could be honest, I think this is my favorite section of Matthew so far, which is always intimidating when you teach that, because it's like, I don't know if I can do justice to it. But I think the opportunity this week is the opportunity to provoke conversation, or at least thought that maybe leads to conversation around these ideas that we would just probably classically call vocation. I really think this section is about vocation. And just so we're all on the same page, I realize it's one of those words that probably most of us have familiarity with, but in case you don't, vocation it just stems from a Latin word that has to do with this idea of calling. And I think where vocation is incredibly valuable is in the way that it tries to allow us to answer the question, why? Why am I here? What does it mean to be human? That's a what, not a why. Like, why do I have this job? Why I am in this season of life? Why am I in this season of my health? Why am I in this season relationally? Like, the awesome thing about vocation, I think, is that it's not tied to a specific season. It's not just a word that's reserved for people in their 30s and 40s who are paying mortgages and trying to think about college for their kids and things like that. It's not an old person word. Vocation connects to every season, whether you're a sixth grader walking the halls of CR, or you're a high school student, or you're about to graduate college, or you're 80 years old and suddenly a widower, whether you're someone who's recently retired, or you recently are an empty nester and you're trying to figure out that, or you are the 40-something or the 30-something with a mortgage and kids to raise. I think the beauty of vocation is that it speaks to every season of life. And not only that, I think one of the great treasures of vocation, and I'll come back to this later because someone taught me this early, is that vocation, if understood well, it's distinct from occupation. For whatever reason, there's probably some theory around the industrial age, I would guess. But we tend to think from our teens forward, what's the job? What's the job that's going to make me happy as a Christ follower? What's the job that's going to allow me to fulfill my purposes? But vocation would push against all of that. And the difference would be occupation tends to assume that there's a specific thing or two that you were made to do. It's maybe almost like the soulmate idea, which I'm not convinced is biblical, that assumes that there's this one kind of golden ticket and a few people are fortunate enough to find the perfect one or the perfect job. Vocation it's more of a bouquet. Like, I think understood well, what vocation causes us to do is recognize that there are a plethora of jobs and seasons of life and relational statuses and ages and health. And that's not to say there's an infinite number. I don't think that's the case either. It does seem clear that even the New Testament, as it talks about things like spiritual gifting, that we aren't all the same version of humanity. That there are probably jobs that you would enjoy that I wouldn't, and vice versa. But again, it scales it. It pushes it from this kind of singular idea to a plethora of ideas. And then there's this cultural moment that we're in. Like, people are tired. And frankly, we started talking about this right when COVID started. You may remember as we were exploring this idea of orientation and disorientation and reorientation, that one of the opportunities of this season would be a call back to vocation. That if you're doing what it is that you do and you're not doing it out of a connected purpose, it's probably going to be a tricky season. But even if you started with good intentions, it's a wearisome season. For kids, I think, for teachers, for small business owners, for medical professionals, for police officers. I mean, there's so many of you that the conversation I have lead me to see that it's a straining time. If you are working, it's like you're working double time and triple time. And I wonder if for you maybe the invitation of this morning isn't a new conversation, but it's a return to a conversation that you haven't kind of picked up in a while. Maybe it takes you back to your college ministry days or your high school days or those seasons of life when you were picking things and you were choosing to go a direction and like you became an attorney for a very specific reason. You're a mom right now for a very specific reason. You're a principal at a high school right now because there was this vocational purpose behind it. And yet, as is the case with life, things get busy and we stray and wander. Maybe the opportunity of this morning is to kind of return to that thread. I mean, of course, the question is, how does a person discover their vocation? And what I want to suggest is, what if that's what Matthew's all about? Like, what if the Gospel of Matthew, sure, it's introducing us to Jesus, of course it is. But isn't the story, and hasn't the story from the very beginning of Matthew been two different versions of humanity? You may remember, we explored in those first few chapters, there's this intentional contrast between the way of Herod and the way of Jesus. And then we even got into the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus kind of builds out, here's how my version of being human is different. And beyond the Sermon on the Mount, he starts talking about faith, and he distinguishes or pushes against this notion that the status with God is something you gain via gender or ethnicity or family of origin or socioeconomic status. And Jesus says, no, status with God is something you gain through confidence in God. Like the story from the very beginning has been a God who's calling apprentices into this unique way of being human. I wonder if we could frame the whole gospel story as not just what God has done, but then the ways in which God invites you to be human in ways consistent with his way of seeing the world. And of course, then it would lead to this question, so how do we discover our vocation? And I wonder if it starts by understanding Jesus' vocation. Now, sometimes when I'm studying Matthew, there's these threads that I pick up on that I think Matthew has weaved throughout. And then, of course, what I have to often choose to do, like evil is a great example of that. Matthew has been teasing this idea of evil for a long time. Next week, we're going to finally deal with it. I think he's been teasing this idea of vocation from the very beginning, and this is the chance to, I think, look at it. We look at it first by going, well, how did Jesus understand his vocation? But before we do even that, I want to go back to the last verse we read 2 weeks ago. Remember we were talking about John the Baptist and the way in which now John is even questioning whether or not Jesus was God's guy. And the very last verse of that section, I think, is quite important to understanding this section. Verse 14, but the Pharisees, they went out and they conspired against him how to destroy him. Now, remember, the Gospels assume familiarity with the story. So it's not like a cliffhanger. It's not like part of the reason why I don't really like watching movies. And then we were just having this conversation as a staff because some people like watch movies over and over and over again. I'm like, I've never understood why would you watch anything other than Top Gun more than once? Like it just doesn't make any sense to me. And then Tom Cruise just keeps delaying the next one. Matthew assumes familiarity. His shtick is not the cliffhanger. He's assuming his original audience already knows how the story ends. He's assuming that his original audience, certainly they wouldn't have had most of them the privilege to read it, but as they're hearing the story, it's not for the great reveal at the end. What's significant then here is this is the first time in Matthew's gospel where it's explicitly stated there was this intent to kill him. There's 10 more times after this, a total of 11 that I can count in Matthew's gospel where this theme is introduced, but this is the first time, which I think then begs this very important question. Like when the news becomes clear to Jesus how the story ends, it's not clear to me when Jesus understood that. I think we got to be really careful assuming that Jesus came pre-programmed with all the knowledge, because that, to me, pushes against what it would mean for him to be fully human as well as divine. So it's not clear when Jesus became clear how the story ended, but at least here, Jesus knows that we know how the story ends, which I think begs this question: what's he going to do now? Like, how is he going to respond to that news? And that's where we get into the first verse of this section. When Jesus became aware of this, aware of what? That they were going to kill him, he departed. Many crowds followed him, and what does he do? He cured all of them, and he ordered them not to make him known. So the question, what does Jesus do in response to the news that they're going to try to kill him? What's the answer? He kind of just keeps plowing. I mean, there's part of you like, well, okay, so now he's going to kind of hold the story down a little bit, but what does Jesus do differently than he did before? The answer is kind of nothing. Like, he just keeps doing what he was doing, which begs this question: why? Or maybe even more importantly, how? In light of his rejection, in light of the resistance, in light of the lack of fanfare, in light of the fact that now his mentor, who some people think was his rabbi, has publicly called him out, how does he find it within himself to just keep doing what he's doing? Remember, we talked at Jesus' baptism about this voice, which comes from Isaiah 40, is being quoted there, who just affirms that Jesus is the guy. And the next thing that happens after his baptism, the temptations. And we kind of teased it then, but there was this was one of those instances where I was like, I kind of want to save this for later on because I love it right here in this section, and you'll see why in just a minute. But the temptations are not just about Jesus' victory over evil, something we'll explore next week. They're also about vocation. Like the invitation being made to Jesus at the temptation was still do what it is you're here to do, still be who it is you're here to be, but do it my way, not God's way. Like, go ahead and practice that thing differently than you would have. Do your job, parent differently. Like, don't do it God's way of being human, do it evil's way of being human. How does Jesus just keep plowing here? I wonder if the answer is vocation. If Jesus had this very clear, resolute clarity, this is who I am, this is what I'm made to do. Whether I'm 12 years old or I'm 30 years old, whether I'm a rabbi or I'm a tecton, whatever it is I find myself doing, whether I'm out in the wilderness with the disciples or I'm on the sea, this is who I am. This is the why behind everything that I'm going to do. It reminds me of this quote from David Brooks in this incredible book called Second Mountain, which I'll come back to. David says it this way: at the beginning, it involves a choice, choosing this or that vocation, but 99.9% of the time, it means choosing what one has already chosen. Go ahead. Just as all writing is really rewriting, all commitment is really recommitment. It's saying yes to the thing you've already said yes to. What if that's vocation? And what if that's how we understand the Jesus story? He may not have known that he was going to die on a cross at the end, but what did he know? That he came to do power in a self-giving love kind of way. That he came to put the divine on display, not with palaces and eloquent books, but through service. I mean, think of even his final week. He washes his disciples' feet, and then he eats this meal with them, and then he goes to the garden and is just crushed by the grief of what's going to happen. And then he's put on trial and mocked and adorned in purple garments and a crown, but a kind of a false kind of crown. And he's beaten, and then he hangs from a cross. And what are the gospel writers telling in that story? Jesus' coronation moment was what? It was a crucifixion. A God who does power through self-giving love. What if Jesus was clear on vocation? And listen to how this continues then. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Now, what follows, I actually just learned this yesterday in reading a commentary, what follows is actually the longest quotation in the Gospels of the Old Testament. But it's not just any quotation, it's from Isaiah. Isaiah where? Isaiah 40 to 55. And if you're with us last December, you may remember we did a whole series in Advent around the suffering servant songs. My personal conviction is one of the surest, clearest ways to understand Jesus in the Old Testament is through that section of Scripture. In fact, I made the argument then that the most weathered part of Jesus' Bible, if you will, the most highlighted, the most read, the most memorized, Jesus' favorite part of the story, we all play favorites with the Bible, it seems clear to me that part of the section of the Testament that he played favorites with was Isaiah 40 to 55. You can go listen to that series on podcast if you want, not because I think the sermons were particularly great, but because I think thematically it really helps to understand Jesus' vocation. But what's the story of Isaiah 40 to 55, or what some people call third Isaiah? The story is a God who called a people through Abram to be the world's servants. Those people fail over and over and over again. They find themselves in exile, and Isaiah 40 begins this theme of more or less, when we read it, especially through the lens of Christ, it's God going, I'll do it. Like what you didn't do, what you couldn't figure out, I'll do it. I'll show up as the servant. The first time Israel was ever referred to as a servant is in Isaiah 41. I'll show up as the servant. I will be that. Now, it's easy for us, it seems like, to read that backwards. The people in Jesus' day didn't see it the way he did, but what seems clear is that when searching for vocation, Jesus anchored his to the suffering servant songs of Isaiah 40 through 55, in which the God says, my way of doing power is through service. My way of being present in the world, my way of showing up is with a towel over my arm. And fittingly then, Matthew quotes that. Here is my servant, whom I've chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him and proclaim justice to the Gentiles. Who's speaking here? Whose voice is this? It's God the Father, isn't it? Ever wondered if you were doing the right thing with your life? Ever had every external bit of feedback telling you that you're wasting your time, that you're wrong, that you shouldn't be doing this? Ever felt like a dismal failure in what it was that you were convinced you were supposed to go do? Why is this an important passage for Jesus? Well, what's going on here? What's Matthew telling us? Somehow he seems to have been given the insight that one of the things Jesus was resolute within the voice of God, affirming to him, you're my guy. And this is my way. Strong parallels here between the voice that's quoted here and the voice that speaks over Jesus at his baptism. But notice it comes from this place of clarity. Vocation comes from a place of clarity, doesn't it? He will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. Why did Jesus, one of the ways one of my early mentors used to say it was, it's very difficult, it's very rare, and you could argue maybe it's never there to find Jesus defending himself. Why doesn't the God of the universe take up arms? Why doesn't he do the things that we do? Seems like he has vocational clarity. This is how I'm going to do it. He will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick until he brings justice to victory. Is he overbearing and mean, or is this Jesus understand that his job is kindness, gentleness, almost to a counterintuitive extent? And in his name, the Gentiles will hope. Now, a whole other bit of emphasis we could point to here is the way in which Matthew in particular turns Isaiah to the Gentiles. And if you read it from the NIV, it softens it, it calls it the nations. But notice that remember we talked about Matthew is the momser gospel. It's the outsider gospel. Matthew, as a rescued tax collector, is very sympathetic to the outsider. But what if Jesus was really, really clear on his vocation? And what if, therefore, the beauty of this passage is when things were going to hell for Jesus, almost literally. And as we'll see in the next section, literally, like as they're now starting to call him evil. How did Jesus stay the course? What if it was because he had this very strong connection to his vocational purpose? Which I think would then raise this question. Well, to what extent, if any, does Jesus' vocation transfer to us? I mean, here's one of the questions that I find kind of vexing is, like, do we all have unique vocations? Or does part of what it means to be Christ, to be Christians, to be like little Christ, is it actually that baptism event is a proclamation of you are adopting his vocation as your own? That you're taking up the mantle, the yoke, he called it earlier, of making God known through self-giving love and through service. To me, it's fascinating because I think we can make a strong argument that we all have the same vocation. That we're all called, no matter what it is that we do. Now, does that mean that we don't have nuanced sides? I think this is where we start to interplay it with things like your Enneagram and your Strengths Finder and your Myers-Briggs, or what Paul calls your spiritual gifts. Like, sure, yeah, we're all unique, and I'm not convinced that that all manifests itself in the same way. But isn't the struggle here like, well, whether you're a teacher or a nurse or an attorney or a stay-at-home parent or a barista or a sixth grader walking the halls or a kid on a baseball team trying to be present to the team, like, we all have the same vocation, don't we? Like, to the extent that we're like united in baptism, it's I'm here to serve. And yeah, that's going to look different, but this is, I think, the gift of vocation. I remember one of the real gifts, looking back in my early 20s, was a mentor that I had. I didn't go to college right out of high school. I worked for Coke for a couple years. He was the one that kind of started to frame for me, like, Adam, I think maybe you should go to school, and here's some ideas. And he wasn't, that wasn't a moral thing. He's not convinced everybody needs to go to college, but just as he learned more and more about me, and he kind of directed me in that way, and then he was instrumental in helping me see, like, probably you should get a teaching degree. It seems like you like to learn, and you talk too much, so maybe you could go that direction. And then I was interning for a church, and quite frankly, he's not a pastor. He was an insurance guy, so he wasn't super fond, I don't think, of the notion of my vocationally or professionally going into church stuff. In hindsight, here's what he pounded into me, was, Adam, you're not made to be a teacher, and you're not made to be a pastor. There's not a single occupation. Like, we try to tell ourselves that that's the way it works. It's not the way it works. He modeled it to me. He's probably the most influential Christ follower in Billings, but he was an insurance agent. And guess what he did? He took his morning break and generally hung out with people and talked about Jesus, and he took his afternoon break and generally talked to people about their marriage or something, and he usually walked with somebody over lunch. And it wasn't that he was lazy. When he retired, he had the biggest book of business, insurance, and Billings, as I understand it. But he brought vocation into occupation. And in hindsight, what he really pounded into me was, Adam, to the extent that you understand vocation, then you'll be freed up to recognize there's lots of jobs that you could do and be right in the sweet spot of the way God made you. Sure, some of them will have different lifestyles and different incomes, and there's different variables, but this has been one of my struggles as working for the church now for 20 years. I tend to work around people who say, if there's something else you can do and be happy, do that. That's kind of the church mantra, and I go, I don't agree. I could point you to several jobs that I think I would really like. It's not that I don't love this. This is, I think, what comes to the surface as a result of COVID. And this is that David Brooks book, The Second Mountain, which I will unapologetically say is the best thing I've read since COVID started. We grabbed a few copies back there. It's kind of mass-produced now, so you can get it for $10. It's an exceptional book, in part because there's a section in there on vocation. And here's where it kind of, I can still take you to the spot on a walk during COVID where I just had this realization. Because like you, it was in this season where nothing seemed certain and everything was tumultuous, and I had no idea whether or not there was a future in Narrate or anything else. And there was this very clear moment where I just realized, like, wait a minute, I could go work at Rockhand Ace Hardware, and I really believe this, and thoroughly live into my vocation. In some ways, I think I would be able to do it better because I'd probably have more energy for other things, like having people over to my house and talking about books and doing Bible studies, and I know I'd still walk with people. Like, I can grab hold of, like, what are the What's the intersection of my vocation and my wiring? Well, I know I like to learn, and I know I like to share what I'm learning, and I know I like to build community, and I know I love the local church. But I am not bound to Narrate to live that out. And that doesn't mean I'm not committed. It doesn't mean I don't love this thing and you guys and this community. But what if that's the gift of this section and the Christ mindset for all of us? That we all, in one sense, share a vocation. We're all called to serve. And then in another sense, there's a lot of jobs, a lot of occupations, a lot of seasons of life. I'm watching some of you do this here who have retired, and now you're using what you did. I mean, what if vocation is paramount and has been in church history because it's vocation that God is most concerned with? Are you on the baseball team so you can hit home runs? Or so you can be the best teammate and the servant of everyone else? Are you on the staff so that you can pay your mortgage, or are you there to serve people? In this season where you're changing diapers in the morning, like, is there a way to do that and feel yourself washing feet, so to speak? Feel yourself putting the towel over your arm? Feel yourself living out, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many. I wonder if the gift of this season, as some of you are wrestling with, do I need to switch careers? That's great. So long as maybe we do that from this vocational center. What if the gift of this season is reuniting us, not with the Western idea of occupation, but with the Jesus idea of vocation? And to get back to that center place of, God, I'm here to serve. So what I want to do this morning, there's actually one more quote from David Brooks that kind of sums this up, and it's an intro in a podcast. He says this: it's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what's the purpose that has been assigned. And I think for a Christ follower, we know what purpose has been assigned. It's just a matter of what clothes we put on it. Break our bodies and pour out our blood for others. So this morning we're going to give you a chance to reflect through communion as has become our routine. And I think the invitation is, it's a vocational reflection. Jesus breaking his body, pouring out his blood, feeding us with his body and blood, but also inviting us into something specific in our everyday. Let's pray. God, thanks that you give us a purpose, and that purpose, it transcends season of life or relational status, or whether we're in 6th grade or we're 40 years old and decades into a career. God, pray that in this season of suffering and opportunity, you'd help us see that opportunity to wear our vocation, to be an extension of who you are and the impact that's made on culture for a couple thousand years now. Amen.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook or Instagram.